Howdy howdy, and welcome to my comprehensive beginner's guide to Magic the Gathering Arena. I hope to show you everything you need to know about MTGA to get started in this vid. Let's dive right in. Alright, so let's begin with the fundamentals. First, let's take a look at an actual card. Take for example this Rumbling Baloth. Phew, that's a lot of text, but don't be intimidated. Let's break it down. Starting from the top and working our way down. On the top left, you can see the card's name in black text, Rumbling Baloth. And across the card from there, you can see three symbols. One gray circle with a number inside, and two green circles with trees inside. These symbols represent the mana cost of the card. This card costs 4 total mana, 2 of which must be green, hence the 2 green tree circles, while the other 2 can be any color, hence the gray circle with a 2 inside. I'll take a brief moment to mention the 5 colors of Magic: white, blue, black, red, and green. Each color represents a different set of cards with unique playstyles. I'll go more in depth about that later. Moving down the card, you have the most prominent display, the artwork. Part of what makes this game so entrancing is the gorgeous artwork that literally every single card puts on display for all of us to enjoy. Every card tells a story. Ugh, beautiful. The artwork, however, doesn't have any effect on the gameplay of the card. Although certain artistic motifs are associated with certain keywords or abilities, such as creatures that have the keyword reach tend to be wielding a bow or crossbow of some kind in their artwork. Fun little tangent aside, the next thing we run into as we travel down the card is the card type. There are many card types, such as sorceries, lands, and enchantments, just to name a few. But don't worry about all that. For now, let's stay focused on the card. This card, in particular, is a creature, with a beast subtype. The main type will always precede the subtype. The symbol you see across the card in this row represents the set this card was released in. Rumbling Baloth was released in the Jumpstart set, for example. And now we arrive at the text box.
The almighty text box.
Most creatures have some sort of special ability or function in addition to their base stats. Those abilities and or functions are displayed here in the text box. This creature does not have any such abilities. This creature simply displays its flavor text to take up the space. I'll talk more about the different abilities and effects that can find themselves here later. For now, let's finish off this card dissection by looking at the power and the toughness. On the bottom right of the card, you'll notice 2 numbers separated by a slash. This isn't a fraction, as it would be in a setting outside of Magic. Nope. In Magic, this is how you signify power and toughness. Power is always on the left, and toughness is always on the right. But what is power and toughness? Well, it's the stats that creatures use for combat. Power, which in this card's instance is 4, is how much damage that card can deal with its attack. Toughness, which for this card is also 4, is how much damage it can take before dying. For the Baloth, this means that it can take up to 3 damage before dying. But once that 4th point of damage is dealt, it's donezo for the Baloth. And that's the basics of a Magic card. Now that you're familiar with the card, we can move on to something a bit beefier. Gameplay. There are many ways to play Magic, but let's stick to Standard for now. In Standard, you're allowed a 60 card deck with a maximum of 4 copies of any given card, with exceptions. Since you're new here, you'll likely be using one of the pre-constructed decks the game provides. This is perfectly fine. In fact, I highly recommend trying out each deck at least a couple of times, just to see what kind of playstyle suits you best. Dip your toe in the water, try things out. Anyways, at the start of every game, both players draw 7 cards. And here comes the first decision of any game, the mulligan. If you don't like the hand that you've drawn, you may shuffle it back into your deck and draw another. But beware, every time you do this, every time you mulligan, you must discard one more card from the resulting hand. That way you can't just mulligan infinitely until you have the perfect hand every time. So it's a risk-reward kind of situation. But what does a good hand look like? I'm so glad you asked. In general, a good hand looks something like 2 to 3 lands, 1 or 2 early game plays, such as a 2 mana or 3 mana creature or 2, and perhaps some card draw or removal, or even a combo piece, if that's the kind of deck that you're running. The idea is you want to have something to do in the early game, but you also don't want to run out of steam after turn 5, all while having interaction with your opponent's game plan as well, ideally. It's very helpful to know your deck, as this will inform you greatly on what you want to keep in your opening hand. But if you're playing a new deck, or otherwise just don't know the deck that you're playing yet, just follow these 5 basic guidelines. 1. 3 lands is best lands. 2. At least 1 early game drop. 3. Removal/card draw is your friend. 4. Don't be afraid to mulligan 2 or even 3 times. And 5. Follow your instincts. First and foremost, you want to have a good number of lands to sustain your play. Too few, namely 1 or even 2 land hands, often simply leave you mana screwed, which means you don't have enough mana to cast your spells. This sucks, and basically guarantees an L. A very frustrating L. And on the flip side of that, you can have too many lands, which is called getting mana flooded. If your hand is nothing but lands, then what good is that? No creatures, no spells, no nothing? That's no good. This is almost equally as frustrating and is just as lethal. Secondly, after lands, you want to look for early game plays. You gotta have something to use those lands for after all. What kind of early game plays you're looking for depends entirely on what kind of deck you're playing. An aggressive mono red deck would look exclusively for 1 to 2 drops and cheap burn, while a blue-white control deck would look more for counter spells and board wipes. No matter what your deck is, however, you want to have something to do in the early game. Otherwise, you're just wasting resources. It's not like in Legends of Runeterra where you can save up 3 spell mana. Once your turn is over, all the mana you could have spent on that turn is gone forever. So, having something to do in your early turns is what you want to mulligan for. Thirdly, you want to look for removal and card draw. I lump these two together because they kind of serve similar purposes. Removal buys you time to find your own threats, and card draw helps you find your big threats, as well as more removal. Both are key to winning any game of Magic. Fourthly, and this is huge, don't be afraid to mulligan 2 or even 3 times. It doesn't happen often, but there have been times when I've been presented with 3 awful hands in a row, and I finally found a good hand 3 mulligans deep. I felt like just conceding, to be honest, but I stuck it out, and you know what? I ended up winning. Keeping a mediocre hand because you're too scared to mulligan is a surefire way to lose a game. So don't be afraid to mulligan a time or 2 or even 3 if you need to. And lastly, and arguably most importantly, trust your instincts. When it comes right down to it, your instincts are all you have to rely on. If you have a half decent hand, but your gut tells you to roll for it, my man. Trust yourself. You'll be right way more often than you'll be wrong. Trust me. And you'll be more satisfied with your plays. Trusting in yourself and playing like it just feels better at the end of the day. And that's the basics of the mulligan. Now, I hate to just throw more words at you, but I have one more thing to go over before we can get to the good stuff. Turns. In Magic, each turn consists of 5 basic steps: the upkeep, first main phase, combat, second main phase, and the end step. They play out like this. During your upkeep, you draw a card, unless you're going first and it's your first turn, in which case you do not draw a card during your upkeep, and untap all your permanents. Tapping is just how you signify that a creature or permanent has been used and cannot be used again until it has been tapped. Next comes your first main phase. You may cast any kind of spell during either of your main phases. Some spells can only be cast during your main phase, such as creatures or sorceries. There is an exception for cards with flash. Cards with flash can be played at any time you could play an instant spell, which is to say any time you have priority. I'll get more into that later. For now, we are making our way into combat. How exciting! If it's your turn, you may declare your attackers by tapping your creatures. I'll explain combat in detail in just a bit. For now, let's stay focused on the turn. Once combat is over, you enter your second main phase. This acts exactly the same as the first main phase, letting you play out spells as you can. And then, at last, you have the end step. This step mostly exists as the time for end of turn effects to resolve. Also in this step is the cleanup step. This is when all combat damage is healed, and you must discard down to 7 cards in hand if you have more than 7 cards in hand. It's all a bit more complicated than I just described, technically speaking, but this basic understanding of the turn will more than suffice to get you started. Now that that's out of the way, we can finally get to the game. Well, actually, there's one more thing I need to talk about. The board. You'll notice some cards at the bottom of the screen. That's your hand. Across the board is your opponent's hand, face down, of course. You little rascal, I know you wanted to see. Anyways, in the center of the screen, you'll see the battlefield. Lands find themselves directly above your hand and to the left, while enchantments and artifacts would find themselves in the same row but on the right. And above them all are creatures in center stage. Down in the far bottom left of the screen, you'll find 3 piles of cards. On the far left is the graveyard, in the middle is your library or your deck, and to the right is the exile zone. Sounds like a 60s TV show. The exile zone is like a graveyard for the graveyard. Don't worry too much about that right now. Across from there, you'll find a button. This button primarily lets you pass from phase to phase and turn to turn. It acts as a confirmation button. And for now, that's all you need to know about the board. Now, finally, we can actually get to the game. I know, I'm playing up against a bot. It's just easier this way. Give me a break, would you? Anywho, I like my opening hand, as it contains everything I could hope for. 3 lands, 2 2-drops, and my game-winning combo, Terror of the Peaks into Calamity Galloping Inferno. That's a keeper right there. I go second, so I got to draw a card on my first turn. The player who goes first does not get to draw a card on their first turn. This is fair, as the player who goes first has a significant advantage, since they get to do everything first, before their opponent does. The player who starts gets priority first, which is a concept I'll get more into later, but for now, just know that having it is good. Neither of us have anything to do on turn 1, but I have 2 options for turn 2. Llanowar Loam Speaker or Wary Thespian. I decided to go for the Thespian first since I don't have anything I can ramp into on turn 2 currently in my hand, so I figure applying some pressure with my 3-1 is the best I can do for now, while I search for more ramp and more threats. But what does that mean, apply pressure? Think of it like this. Imagine your opponent is a balloon. Whenever you attack them, you're blowing them up, with the end goal being to make them pop. The greater the pressure inside the balloon, the more likely it is to burst. And that's exactly what attacking with your creatures does. It blows up that balloon, applying more and more pressure until pop. So, focusing back on the game, a creature with 3 power applies 3 times the pressure that a creature with 1 power could. And since the extra mana wasn't useful until much later, the better play was to play the Thespian and not only apply more pressure, but also curate our next draw, which as it turns out was a really good thing for us because we were going to draw what was basically a dead card had we not surveilled it away, which is the special ability of the Wary Thespian. Surveil lets you look at the top card of your library and decide whether you want to keep it there or put it into your graveyard. This helps you search for the cards that you want and get rid of the cards that you don't need. Need a land but don't see one in your Surveil? Throw that trash in the garbage and give yourself another shot at hitting a land. This also potentially protected the Loam Speaker from removal. Since the Thespian does apply a decent amount of pressure, it can potentially eat some removal, which would pave the way for the Loam Speaker to survive and get value. So I played out the Thespian. Why can't I attack with him? Well, creatures that enter the battlefield this turn suffer from what's known as summoning sickness and cannot attack the turn they were summoned. Creatures with haste, however, are the exception, as they can attack the turn they were summoned. Decks like Mono Red Aggro take full advantage of the haste keyword. It's quite potent. But alas, we do not have it. On this creature, that is. We do have haste on Calamity Galloping Inferno, which you'll see later has devastating capabilities. Moving on, my opponent plays an enchantment. An enchantment is a special kind of permanent spell that has some sort of effect or aura that affects the game. This particular one lets our opponent draw cards whenever they play beefy creatures. Very thematic. Enchantments stick around unless they are specifically removed by a spell or effect. Afterward, my opponent plays a Baloth Pack Hunter, a 3/3 with Trample, a fearsome beast, but nothing we can't handle. Some creatures, such as this Generous Stray, have effects that trigger when they enter the battlefield. When Generous Stray enters the battlefield, or ETBs for short, they draw a card. Not too shabby. A bit expensive at 3 mana, but it's not the worst card I've ever seen. It's pretty bad though. It's not good. Opponent attacks in with their Baloth and we get our first taste of real combat. Finally! Yes, sir! How does this work out? Let's dig right in. So the first thing you'll want to note is the power and toughness of each creature. The Baloth has 3 power and 3 toughness, while my Thespian has 3 power but only 1 toughness. Here's how combat works. When creatures fight each other in combat, they deal damage to each other based on how much power they have. So, since both creatures have 3 power, both creatures take 3 points of damage. There are exceptions, such as creatures with first strike, but in general, damage is dealt at the same time. Now we need to consider their toughness. The Baloth has 3 toughness and it took 3 damage, so it dies. 3 minus 3 equals 0. The Thespian only has 1 toughness, and it took 3 damage as well, so it is definitely dead. There is something important to note here though. The most observant of you will have noticed that the Baloth didn't stop at the Thespian. It went on to hit my face as well. This is because it has Trample. Trample is a keyword that means that any excess damage dealt by that creature during combat is dealt directly to the opponent's face. So, as in this example, the Baloth dealt 3 total damage and the Thespian blocked 1 with its toughness, so I took 2 damage to my face. Ouch! And here you get to see the mega combo. Literally the most powerful combo the deck has. 6 Terror of the Peaks triggers for 28 direct damage, backed up by 19 power swinging in on the board. It literally doesn't get better than that for this deck. Of course, it's just a bot, but hey, it still feels pretty good. Don't worry if this combo is a bit intimidating, it's just the icing on my ego-fueled cake. You'll get there, and soon if you watch my videos. But that's all we have time for today. If you made it this far, you're a fucking legend, and I hope that your coffee is always the right temperature. Good luck and have fun out there, y'all, and I'll see you in the next vid.